I've been married for 20 years. I never thought I would want to get rid of the memories of that time. Every time it hurts me to remember how I lived a lie without realizing it. I don't want to seem like a victim because I realize it's my fault. I should have been more careful and not so gullible. I want to share my story and what I have faced. My name is Frank Miller. If I were asked how I would describe my life, I would say it's ordinary. Not too exciting, but not too bad either. I live in a small, cozy house on the edge of town. Every house here looks like a slightly modified copy of its neighbor. My wife, Sarah, and daughter, Amy, are my beacon in the sea of everyday life. Sarah is not just my wife, she is my best friend and trusted ally. She is by far the most beautiful person I have ever met. Her long hair is always perfectly styled and sparkling in the sunshine, and her smile can light up the darkest room. Working at a local bank, she often complains about the routine, but I know she takes pride in being able to support our family. Amy, our daughter, is now 17. She is growing up independent and smart. Her eyes are full of curiosity and lust for life, which always reminds me of our youth. Amy dreams of going to college next year, and I couldn't be a prouder father. As for my job, it may not be a dream, but it supports my family, and that's what matters most. I work for a real estate management company. My days are often filled with calls, meetings, and endless reports. But when I come home tired after a long day and see Sarah and Amy's smiles, I realize that sometimes it's worth it to make a change in my routine. I might treat myself to a visit to the bar, perhaps have a couple pints of beer with friends. Kevin, one of my closest friends, often joins me. We've been friends for years. I value our friendship. He's someone I can share everything with. Sometimes, though, I wonder how well I know him. One Friday morning started out as usual. Sarah was already up and making breakfast. She was humming something to herself. It's one of the little things I love about her. Her ability to find joy in ordinary things fascinates me. I walked up behind her and hugged her. The smell of her hair was delightful. She turned around and smiled at me. Her smile made me forget everything in the world. "Good morning, darling," she said. We exchanged kisses. In those moments, I felt like the happiest person on the planet. My relationship with Sarah has always felt like the foundation of my existence. 20 years together, and my love for her grew stronger every day. Amy was coming down to the kitchen. Her eyes were still half asleep, but her smile blossomed at the sight of Sarah and me. I had always tried to maintain an atmosphere of love and warmth in our home. I hoped that this feeling would stay with Amy and me for a lifetime. After breakfast, I decided that today was a good day to visit a local bar in the evening. How about having a few beers tonight? Maybe call Kevin? I suggested to Sarah. I knew she wouldn't mind. She had always supported my need to spend time with friends. She understood how important it was to me. "Sure, honey, that sounds great. You deserve a little break," she replied with a smile. I was grateful for her unwavering support and understanding. I sent a message to Kevin. He, as always, responded with enthusiasm. Kevin was someone I could discuss anything in the world with. Our friendship with Kevin started back in college. Despite all the changes in our lives, we remained close friends. Seeing him was always a relief to me. They allowed me to take my mind off my daily worries. We discussed how our wives watched a soccer game. All in all, we had a good time. Gladly, I headed home where my beautiful wife was waiting for me. The next day started as usual, except that Sarah went to her parents' house for the weekend. Amy went to a friend's house for the night. Left alone, I decided this was the perfect opportunity to relax. I decided to spend the evening alone. I even thought about watching a movie that I had been putting off for a long time. After a few hours of watching, I felt the need for a break. I headed to the bathroom, but as I was about to flush the toilet, I discovered that it was clogged. The water started leaking out. My irritation instantly increased. Surprises like this always happen at the most inconvenient times. I had no other options. I called the plumbing service. To my surprise, they arrived very quickly. The job took no more than an hour. However, what followed next was a real shock to me. One of the workers seemed to have found the cause of the clog. He took out some used condoms. He convinced me to throw them in the garbage instead of the toilet. I was horrified. Sarah and I had long ago stopped using them, relying on other methods of contraception. Thoughts began to swirl in my head. How did they end up here? Could our daughter have done this? But then I realized that Amy couldn't have sex, at least not in our house. I just wouldn't allow it. Still, I decided that I would talk to my daughter discreetly. In that moment, I realized that I needed to proceed cautiously, decided that a direct conversation with Sarah could wait. I tried to gather my thoughts. It was important to test suspicions before drawing any conclusions. I spent the rest of the evening trying to distract myself from the painful thoughts. However, the images of those condoms never left my mind. The next day, Amy came home. I decided to talk to her. "How was your friend's sleepover?" I asked. "It was fine, Dad. And how did you spend the evening?" She replied. "I was fine too, without incident," I said. I wanted to ask, "Do you have a boy?" She smiled. "It all depends on which one you want. Brunette, blonde, brown hair, redhead, blonde hair, gray hair?" She joked. "I'm serious," I said. "Dad, you and I have discussed this many times. I'm not going to get into a relationship just yet," she said. I realized this was clearly not Amy. I didn't tell her about last night's incident, deciding it would be unnecessary. My wife was due back tomorrow, but the decision to contact a private investigator didn't come immediately. I spent several days weighing the pros and cons, trying to find another way out, but every thought kept bringing me back to this decision. I did a preliminary search on the internet and found a private investigator with good reviews and experience in similar cases. After calling him, I made an appointment. It was important for me to meet in person so that I could trust this person with such intimate details of my life. We met in a neutral place in a small cafe. There I told him everything about condoms, my suspicions, and how much I valued my family. I did not hide my anxiety and fear of the possible outcome of his work. The detective listened to me intently, without interrupting, and nodded as he took notes. After I finished, he looked me straight in the eye and promised to do his best to find out the truth while keeping the information confidential. We discussed the details, including the cost of his services and possible methods of tracking Sarah. I realized I was violating her privacy, but my anxiety and desire to know the truth took over. After signing the contract and paying the deposit, I let the detective begin his work. The 2 weeks of waiting were a real challenge for me. I tried to act normal, but it was getting harder and harder to maintain a semblance of a normal family life. My eyes on Sarah were filled with a mixture of love and doubt. Every call or message on her phone made my heart beat faster. I tried to hide my excitement, but sometimes I thought she sensed something was wrong. Finally, after 2 long weeks, the detective contacted me. He suggested we meet to discuss his findings. I realized that the detective was onto something, but I couldn't understand how I hadn't noticed anything suspicious about my wife. The next day, we'd arranged to meet at a coffee shop. Sitting down at a table, I tried to calm myself down with a cup of coffee, but each sip seemed bitter. The time until the detective arrived dragged on endlessly. When he finally showed up, I felt my heart start to beat even faster. The detective seemed as calm and collected as ever. He sat across from me, took several envelopes out of his briefcase and placed them on the table. "Frank," he began, "I've done a thorough investigation into your request. Here's what I've been able to find out." The first envelope contained photographs of Sarah and Kevin together in various places, at a cafe, at the market, at our house, and at his. In each photo, they were too close together for just friends. The next envelope contained excerpts from the surveillance reports. The detective detailed their meetings, conversations that had been overheard, and even their visits to one of the hotels. As I read these lines, I felt my life begin to crumble before my eyes. I also spoke to several people who had seen them together. They all confirmed that Sarah and Kevin were acting like a couple. The detective watched my reaction. I listened to him, feeling numb. Part of me still hoped that this was just a misunderstanding, that there was a reasonable explanation for everything that was happening. "What do I do now?" I asked when the detective was done. My voice sounded foreign even to me. The detective sighed. "Frank, I can't tell you what to do. It's your life, your choice, but remember, no matter what, there's always a way forward." Back home after meeting with the detective, I felt like I was in a fog. I needed time to think things over. In a rush of emotion, I decided not to take any action. It was important to make an informed decision despite the pain and betrayal I had endured. The next day, I went to a bar to meet Kevin. I wanted to look at him through the lens of doubt and try to engage him in dialogue. When I saw Kevin enter the bar, My hands involuntarily clenched into fists. He approached me with a smile, not noticing my gaze. His expression changed. "Hey Frank, how's it going?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "We need to talk, Kevin," I said quietly, trying to control my emotions. "What's up, buddy? What's up?" he asked. "I suspect my wife of cheating and I don't know what to do," I began cautiously. "Really? Why do you suspect?" Kevin asked, surprised. I started noticing strange things. She's staying late at work, she's spending more time on her phone, we've started having less sex, and overall it seems like she's lost interest in me, I explained. "You know, I think you're just overworked and shouldn't worry," Kevin began and asked the bartender to pour us a beer. "My Deborah acts weird sometimes too, but after a while everything goes back to normal. If you find proof, it's time to raise a red flag, but otherwise it's just empty worries," Kevin finished. I looked him straight in the eye. He said it with an unforced calm and a cold stare, trying to convince me that everything was fine at this point. I wanted to pull out the evidence folder, but held back. I didn't rush things. I tried to get to the truth by asking more direct and provocative questions. Kevin, however, kept dodging. Eventually, I realized I was getting nowhere. My suspicions were confirmed not only by the detective's words, but also by Kevin's behavior. He knew I suspected something. His reaction was a clear confirmation of that. After my failed encounter with Kevin, I felt devastated. It was clear to me that the next step was to talk to Sarah. But I also realized that talking alone wouldn't be enough. She needed to feel my pain, or at least be held accountable for what she'd done. I needed to get in touch with Kevin's wife, Deborah, so I went to her social media page and sent her a message. I suggested we meet, but Kevin wasn't supposed to know. I sent her blurbs as proof of her husband's infidelity. Deborah agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near our neighborhood, a place where we could talk without unnecessary ears. I arrived early and chose a secluded table in the corner so we could talk freely. My heart pounded as I waited for her arrival. Part of me still hoped it was just a bad dream, but deep inside, I knew the truth. When Deborah walked in, I immediately saw the reflection of my anxiety in her eyes. She looked tense, but at the same time, there was determination in her demeanor. We greeted each other. She sat down across from me. "Frank, I don't even know where to begin," she began. Her voice shook with emotion. "Deborah, I understand how difficult this must be for you. But we both know why we're here," I said, trying to maintain eye contact. She nodded, took a deep breath, and began to speak. Deborah told me that she had suspected Kevin's cheating for a while, but she didn't want to believe it without reason. She'd noticed how he'd started staying late at work more often, how his behavior had changed in recent months. But Deborah had no concrete evidence, only vague suspicions and fears. I told her about the detective, about the photos and reports I'd managed to get. Her eyes filled with tears as she listened, but she held firm. When I finished, there was a heavy silence. "Frank, I'm so sorry for what happened. I didn't know Kevin could be like that with Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Deborah, it's not your fault. We both faced betrayal we didn't deserve," I replied, feeling the solidarity between us in this difficult situation. We discussed how we should both proceed. I proposed a plan to Deborah that I felt would kill two birds with one stone. She agreed. The plan was to make my wife jealous. Deborah was to go home and tell Kevin that she was going into town tomorrow to be with her parents since her mom was supposedly in the hospital and needed to be there for her. Meanwhile, I didn't go home in the evening but stayed at the hotel with Deborah. My wife would call me to see where I was. Deborah would pick up the phone and start arguing with my wife. During the argument, Sarah would come to the hotel and we would reveal their affair. It was a fairly simple plan, but it seemed to me to be the most effective. The next morning I left for work and so did Sarah. Deborah informed me that Kevin had let her go. Everything went according to plan. I finished work at 6 in the evening and headed straight to the hotel as my wife was due to finish work at 5. Deborah was already waiting for me in the hotel room. We started preparing all the documents and words we had to say. 2 hours passed and I received a text message from Sarah. "Honey, I'm stuck at work. We're going to be late." They made me do the report again. I realized things were not going well. Sarah was probably with Kevin or she really did have work to do. I didn't know what to do. In the end, suggested to Deborah that we reschedule the meeting for the next day. Deborah was to stay in the room for the night and I planned to go home. Deborah came out into the hallway with me to walk me to my car. As we were walking down the hallway, we saw Kevin. He was walking with a bottle of water and in his bathrobe with his head down. He didn't notice us initially, but then he looked up and saw us along with Deborah. "Dan, Frank, what are you doing in a hotel with my wife?" Deborah was supposed to be at her mother's. Kevin said sternly. I realized I needed to change my plan of action. I grabbed Kevin by the neck and pinned him against the wall, covering his mouth. I was bigger and stronger than him, so he couldn't resist. "Now listen to me carefully. I know you're sleeping with my wife and it's pointless for you to deny it. In order for me not to hurt you, you have to tell me the room number where Sarah is," I said. Kevin blushed. I loosened my grip slightly and Kevin, with an interrupted breath, called out the room number, 219. I grabbed Kevin by his robe and forcefully dragged him to Deborah's room, who was watching everything that was going on. I dragged him into the room, took his cell phone out of his pocket and locked it in the bathroom so it wouldn't be in the way. I left Deborah alone with Kevin, hinting that it was time for them to talk. I changed into my robe and headed to room 219. I entered without knocking and saw a small coffee table with a bottle of wine, 2 glasses, a platter of fruit and cheese, and lit candles creating a welcoming atmosphere. Suddenly, I heard my wife's voice from the bathroom. "Oh, sweetie, you're back. I'm almost done. Go lie down in bed. I'll come to you soon," Sarah said. I didn't say anything back to her. I obediently went to bed and waited for her to appear. Suddenly, the door opened and there stood a real beauty, my wife Sarah in a revealing bunny costume, which I had never seen on her before. She looked really sexy. "I've missed you so much, Tiger," she began, obviously not recognizing me in the dark. "I missed you too, my soon-to-be wife," I blurted out, and her silhouette froze. "That's not Sarah," she muttered after a couple seconds. "Oh, really?" I replied. "It's not what you think," she began. "Really? And I thought you were getting ready for a pajama party," I said. "Sweetie, please don't be mad," she begged. "Why did you do that?" I asked. At that moment, an angry Deborah burst into the room screaming, "There you are," and attacked Sarah, starting a fight. It was amusing to watch them fight. With Deborah clearly gaining the upper hand, she ended up holding on to most of Sarah's hair. I was lying on the bed and didn't even think about separating them. But then, when Deborah suddenly grabbed a bottle of wine, planning to hit Sarah over the head with it, I intervened, took the bottle away from her and said, "You don't want to go to jail for this." They continued to struggle, with Deborah pulling Sarah's hair as she hysterically screamed for help. Deborah then threw Sarah to the ground and started scratching her face with her fingernails, which was truly epic. I found out later that Deborah had a one-on-one conversation with Kevin and Kevin told her something that drove Deborah crazy. I didn't think my former friend was such a fool to say such things to his wife, but what he said I will tell you later. I realized it was time to end the fight and pull Deborah away from Sarah, who was lying helplessly on the floor. I pulled out the folder with the divorce papers and a copy of the photos the private investigator had given me. I hope you realize that every action has consequences. In this folder is all the evidence of your cheating, I told Sarah, handing her the papers she needed to sign. "I don't want a divorce," Sarah barely audibly whispered. "What do you want then? We'll get a divorce and you can live with Kevin. He'll be free soon too," I said. Sarah tearfully began to plead. "The only thing we can do is to keep our daughter from finding out all the horrible details?" she asked. "Tell the truth about why, when and how you started secretly dating my friend," I said. I helped Sarah stand up. Deborah handed her a bottle of water, and we waited a few minutes for Sarah to come to her senses and calm down. It all started about 4 months ago. Sarah began her story. "Kevin came to our house while you were at work. He said he came to see you without knowing you were at work." She paused briefly. "I let him know you were at work and that we had plans for tonight. I offered him tea as a sign of hospitality, but we never finished it. He started talking about how he dreamed of me, how he envies you because you have such a wife. He started touching me. I resisted, but he insisted and I couldn't help it. He convinced me that it would only be one time and no one would know. He ended up taking me to bed," she continued. "A few days after that I was going to tell you everything, but Kevin showed up on your doorstep again while you were at work. At first I turned him down and told him I would tell you everything. but he pulled out his phone and showed me a video of us having sex. He threatened that if I told anyone, he would ruin my life and the video would go viral on all social media. From then on, he came to me whenever he wanted and called me wherever he wanted. He threatened me and I was too scared to tell you. It seemed too late to say anything. She finished her side of the story. Deborah and I exchanged glances. I realized that Sarah was lying, trying to portray herself as the victim in this situation. You're lying because Kevin told me a completely different story. He said you were the one who stalked and blackmailed him, Deborah began. Now I understood why Deborah was so angry. She thought my wife was the provocateur. That's all nonsense. It's time to end this circus, Sarah said, apologizing. I helped her to her feet and led her into the bathroom. She tried to kiss me, but I turned away, feeling disgusted. I walked with Sarah into the bathroom but quickly walked out, locking the door behind me. Think about your behavior. I yelled at her as I left the room. Deborah and I walked into the other room where Kevin was locked in the bathroom. After gathering our things, we walked to the door. I thought you were my friend, but you turned out to be a real rascal, I said with disappointment. Deborah and I left the room and handed the keys to the hotel receptionist. The next morning, the cleaning lady was to release the traitors. We went our separate ways. I didn't tell my daughter what had happened or that we were going to divorce her mother, but I knew I would have to do so in the next few days. The next day, I contacted the most expensive attorney in town and met with him at a coffee shop to discuss the details of the divorce and to ensure that Sarah and Kevin would be severely punished for their betrayal. Back home, where Sarah was waiting for me and my daughter was at school, Sarah immediately tried to apologize. I handed her the paper and said, "We need to get a divorce. It will be better for both of us." A few days later, she finally signed them. I stayed home because I didn't want our daughter to suspect anything while Sarah was at work. When Amy came home for lunch, I asked her to stay with me in the living room after she finished eating. She looked at me questioningly, but nodded in agreement. Taking Amy's hands in mine, I looked into her eyes. "Amy, I need to talk to you about something important," I began, trying to choose my words carefully to prepare her as gently as possible for the conversation ahead. "Your mom and I are going through some difficulties and we're trying to work things out. I want you to know that no matter what happens, we both love you very much and nothing is going to change," I continued, feeling a lump in my throat. Amy looked at me with wide eyes in which I saw a mixture of understanding and fear. "Daddy, are you and Mom getting a divorce?" she asked bluntly, surprising me with her insight. Shrewdness, yes. "Amy, if Mom wants to, she'll tell you herself what happened. But it's important that you know we'll always be there for you," I said, feeling my eyes begin to fill with tears. Amy silently threw herself into my arms and we hugged, feeling the heaviness and complexity of the moment. "I love you both so much," she whispered. That conversation with Amy was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had, but at the same time it brought relief. It was important for her to know the truth, to feel involved and to understand what was going on in her family. This was the first step to resolving our situation, a step I had to take before moving on. I packed my things and left for a hotel, as I could no longer stay in a house with someone who had blatantly cheated me. A month later, the trial took place and Sarah and I divorced. I left her the house she lived in with our daughter and committed to paying child support every month. Deborah divorced Kevin, who was out of town. Sarah had hoped that Kevin would want to live with her after our divorce, but he turned out to be a coward and decided to run away. While I was looking for a place to live, Deborah invited me over to her house. We ended up having sex and eventually Deborah invited me to stay with her permanently. I liked that idea and we started living together. I don't know where it will lead, but I hope it will only get better. This is the end of my story.
Thank you so much for watching my video and your time. Please subscribe to my channel and click on the bell button. Also, I am very interested to know your personal opinion about this story. You can write it in the comments. I will definitely answer you personally.